Emirates. Boeing 777, carrying up to 354 people, almost crashed on December 20th, 2021, shortly after takeoff from Dubai. Even though this near miss occurred only a few days ago, information is starting to surface that begs major concerns about the safety culture of one of the top airlines in the world, as well as the reliance of pilots on technology. One of the most intriguing human factors case studies in recent memory might be this one. On December 20th, 2021, shortly before 3 in the morning, Emirates Flight 231 pushed back from Terminal 3 of Dubai International Airport. The 14-hour trip was intended for Washington, D.C. There were 4 pilots on this flight because of its duration. The flight from Dubai would be operated by 2 pilots, and the so-called relief crew would eventually take over throughout the flight. 2 days before, the aircraft, a 4-year-old Boeing 777, had arrived from Zurich. Because of its exceptional safety record and fuel efficiency, airlines all over the world adore the 777, a very complex and modern aircraft. With 153 777s in operation, Emirates is the largest 777 operator in the world. The crew of Flight 231 was probably finishing up their pre-takeoff checklists as it taxied out to runway 30R at Dubai. It was a perfect weather window to fly. It was 21 degrees C, there was no breeze, and the skies were clear. The pilots lined up on the runway and started the engines for departure at 9 minutes past 3 in the morning. Before long, they were traveling at their typical takeoff speed of 270 km/h as they began rolling down the runway. But at this point, they didn't take off. Rather, they kept speeding down the runway without stopping. They eventually got the plane airborne a few seconds later as they raced off the end of the runway at 400 km/h. By now, though, the pilots were traveling northwest of Dubai Airport at approximately 500 km/h, hovering only 75 feet above the tops of the residential buildings instead of securely ascending above the ground. A 777's wingspan is longer than 75 feet. They kept flying down this route, barely missing collisions with residential complexes in the densely populated Dira area of Dubai. After passing over the coast, they started a quick ascent, and soon after took off again on their usual course. The crew decided to continue their 15.5-hour journey to Washington, D.C., instead of returning to Dubai, arriving in Washington Dulles Airport around 9:30 a.m. local time. According to accounts, the aircraft was damaged before takeoff. It was grounded for 4 days while it was inspected for damage, and it returned to Dubai as normal later that day. It has recently come to light that the initial claims, which claimed that all 4 of the pilots on board had been sacked, do not seem to be accurate. Though the reason for such a near miss is difficult to fathom, one significant hint was provided by Emirates 1 week following the incident when it sent a NOTAM, or notice to airmen, warning all of its pilots of a possible problem. Put simply, Emirates is warning, or rather, reminding, its pilots not to adjust the autopilot panel's altitude after landing. They claim that there have been occasions when prior crews adjusted the autopilot altitude to 0, causing problems for the aircraft during takeoff. 7 days before to this NOTAM, the event involving Emirates Flight 231 may probably be safely assumed to have been one of such occasions. This NOTAM suggests that the previous crew on Flight 231 had set the autopilot altitude to 0 upon arrival in Dubai, and that this had gone unnoticed by the new pilots who were scheduled to take the aircraft to Washington prior to takeoff. If this is accurate, they have committed a grave error, which is made worse by the possibility that there were 4 pilots in the cockpit at the time. Even while all the facts are yet unknown, it's quite likely that this evening's events were the result of human error, or to put it more bluntly, a string of almost disastrous mishaps. I say series of mistakes because it's common practice to double-check the mode control panel's altitude setting several times prior to takeoff. After receiving the all clear to depart from air traffic control, the pilots typically select this altitude first, and it is subsequently checked multiple times prior to takeoff. The Emirates NOTAM raises the possibility that the pilots simply followed the flight director's directions during takeoff, which uses data from the autopilot to direct the pilot's inputs into the controls. On the primary flight display in front of each pilot is a pink bar that is both vertical and horizontal. This is the flight director. It indicates to the pilot where the wing and nose should be pointed in order to fly the aircraft according to the flight plan. Instead of telling them to raise the nose of the aircraft, the flight director would have been resting on the primary flight display's horizon if the autopilot's altitude had been set to 0. Stated differently, it's possible that the pilot, whomever he was following the instruments without question, rather than applying common sense and taking off when the plane achieved takeoff speed. Though it may be argued that they were doing a very good job of not flying, if this scenario is accurate, it also indicates that the pilot not flying, also referred to as the pilot monitoring, wasn't doing a very good job of monitoring. The pilots didn't actually get airborne until the plane had left the end of the runway. They did not, however, begin to climb. Rather, they soared above the earth at a speed of hundreds of kilometers per hour, surpassing their own wingspan. Once more, this can be explained by the possibility that the pilot was blindly adhering to the flight director's instructions to fly into the ground. The reason for the pilot's decision to eventually pull up and fight to safety when they neared the coast is still unknown, but every second leading up to that moment, the plane was just a few seconds away from colliding and killing hundreds of people on board, and many more on the ground. This may have easily been the worst aviation accident of the century thus far. The crew would not have wanted to take the chance of a mechanical malfunction when out in the Atlantic Ocean. Therefore, it seems unlikely that this issue was mechanical in nature. Instead, they would have made an emergency return to Dubai. A troll who has been reading expert pilots' discussions of this incident on internet forums says that automation dependency may have been the cause of this incident. Particularly at Emirates, a high degree of automation is a well-known aspect of both standard operating procedures and training. When flying, Emirates pilots are trained to utilize the highest level of automation available to them practically all the time. Pilots flying a visual approach are reportedly even accustomed to entering the approach into their flight management computer and letting the autopilot handle the flying. If they choose to pilot it by hand, they will, at most, do it by following the flight director instead of gazing through the windshield. This is an extreme case, even in an industry where automation is becoming more and more necessary. Such operations erode pilots' manual flying proficiency and place them in a situation where they eventually lose faith in their flying abilities and turn into automation supervisors. This is not at all like how airlines do business in the United States, where maintaining handling skills through manual flying is emphasized. Rather than doing a short final like they do in Europe and other areas of the world, pilots in the US typically fly manually to a high altitude after departure, use the autopilot, then turn it off during the initial descent. Automation is used by pilots in the United States as a technique to lessen effort when necessary, but not always. The aircraft's flight is the primary concern. Management of automation comes second. Close calls like the one on Emirates Flight 231 serve as a stark reminder of the danger associated with increasing reliance on technology. When pilots are taught to fly by following blindly, instead of using the so-called raw data of altitude, airspeed, pitch, and power high-level automation, they are left out in the cold if the automation is not configured properly. When the pilots of Flight 231 realized that the flight controller was delivering absurd instructions, they ought to have gone back to using extremely basic flying techniques. They ought to have disregarded the flight director's persistent fixation on the horizon once they had achieved takeoff velocity and proceeded to launch the aircraft. Airplane by hand, while disregarding the flight controller, and after they were safely ascending away from the ground, they started troubleshooting the problem. The crew's decision to allow the aircraft to crash into the end of the runway prior to takeoff indicates a startling, and in this instance, almost fatal, lack of common sense on the flight deck. Furthermore, it is unlikely that this was just a case of one pilot making a mistake, due to the possibility of up to 4 pilots being present in the cockpit at the time. Instead, it points to a much more serious problem with egregiously poor crew resource management. Everything that we now know about this occurrence relates to the airlines and the industry's training culture in general. The fact that long-haul pilots conduct considerably fewer takeoffs and landings each month than short-haul pilots exacerbates this automation dependency issue. They spend a far larger portion of their day on cruise flight, which entails keeping an eye on the aircraft's performance and its progress as it follows the flight path. In contrast, short-haul pilots have more practical experience flying the aircraft and spend a greater proportion of their time in high workload scenarios, close to takeoff and landing. Long-haul pilots may eventually lose contact with their aircraft and begin to view their roles more as managers of aircraft systems than as operators of moving vehicles. It's important to remember that this flight took place late at night, so exhaustion might have also played a role. The news media will have moved on from this entire episode in a few weeks. However, it's important to keep in mind how dangerously close this flight was to becoming a total failure. This near miss may have been caused by significant issues with pilot training and the company's safety culture if the scenarios shown in this episode prove to be true. Emirates has one of the strictest pilot selection and training procedures in the world, along with an outstanding safety record. Although its fleet is very new and well maintained, there are growing weaknesses in this critical area of crew resource management and automation dependence. At Emirates, this was by no means the only instance of its kind. Over the past 4 years, the airline has seen several serious near misses, some of which have been almost fatal. During 2016, a 777 carrying 300 passengers crashed upon landing in Dubai as a result of the pilot's poor control of the automation following a failed go-around. After landing, the airplane caught fire, forcing all occupants to leave. One fireman lost his life when the center wing tank exploded during the post-crash fire, leaving 32 persons injured overall, 4 of them critically. Emirates is not the only company experiencing this issue with reliance on automation. Since at least the 1990s, It has been recognized that manual flying skills are deteriorating, and several high-profile crashes have been caused by this exact issue. Examples from recent memory are Asiana Flight 214, which crashed barely above the runway in San Francisco in 2013, injuring 187 passengers and killing 3. Another example is Air France Flight 447, which crashed off the coast of Brazil in 2009, killing all 228 people on board. Close encounters like the one with Emirates Flight 231 demonstrate that this issue still exists, and that another tragic tragedy might not be far off if significant adjustments are not made to the way pilots are taught. Thank you all for tuning in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on our future content. Until next time, stay curious, stay creative, and keep exploring.